Hello again, I'm Kathy Jordan from the University of Minnesota, and welcome to part 2 of documenting community engagement in the promotion and tenure process. During the first video, I talked about definitions of community engagement, scholarship, and community engaged scholarship, and I made distinctions between concepts like scholarly and scholarship and conventional and innovative scholarly products because these are relevant to the promotion and tenure success strategies that I'll be sharing in our webinar. I also talked about the common challenges faced by community-engaged scholars in the promotion and tenure process, because they suggest the focus of the strategies for success. At the end of the first video, I suggested that we'd next be seeing each other on the webinar and cover the remaining topics. We decided to present some additional information by video before the webinar to allow for some time for discussion in the webinar. So, picking up from where we left off from the first recorded lecture, in this video, I'm going to focus on overcoming the challenges by pulling scholarship from your engagement, disseminating a range of conventional and innovative scholarly products, and understanding what makes quality community-engaged scholarship. When we do see each other for the webinar, we'll then take a deeper dive into effective and practical dossier preparation strategies. So, thinking about our topic in a little bit different way, recall that I suggested in the first video 6 strategies for overcoming the challenges facing community-engaged scholars in the promotion and tenure process. I talked about knowing your university and your department's context and your promotion and tenure guidelines, and educating your colleagues about what you do, the rigor of your engaged work, and the impact that you make on the field and in the community. In this video, I'll expand on the 2 criteria in blue, and we'll talk about documentation when we see each other on the webinar. So pulling scholarship from engagement means finding as many worthwhile ways to document something from your engaged work, subject it to critique, and disseminate it broadly. This is a critical strategy for success in promotion and tenure. In most institutions, regardless of the emphasis of the faculty member's work, whether that be research or teaching, clinical work, or service activities, producing scholarship products is typically required for career advancement. Community-engaged activities actually offer a host of opportunities for scholarship. So let's look at what you might document and how you might disseminate that for research activities and for teaching activities. Remember a couple of distinctions from the first video, conventional and innovative, well, let me cite that again. So remember a couple of distinctions from the first video. Conventional products, meaning like the manuscript or in some disciplines, the book, these can be used to disseminate information about the work, its processes, its tools used, and its results. But there are also innovative products of community-engaged scholarship. These can be things like training videos, documentaries, curricula, slides, things like that. They can be used to disseminate about the work as well, such as the documentary or lessons learned, but also could represent actual products that were created along the way as part of the work and that could be used by others. Maybe it's assessment instruments or a curriculum or a training video or an intervention manual. So back to the question of what kinds of scholarly products could you pull out of engaged research and teaching? So for teaching, you could document the pedagogical approach that you use. You could publish that in an article or a manual or a toolkit or a curriculum. You could publish the curriculum itself. You could document the collaboration formation that you developed with a community partner to do a service learning course, for example. And again, you could publish that as part of an article. You could also make a video about it. You could publish a lessons learned article. You could document student outcomes. What they learned, social, emotional, or character development, or ethical development. You could publish that in an article. You could make a little documentary about it. You could also publish something around educational research or in a policy brief. You could document community benefit. You could do that through video, digital storytelling. You could also document that in an article. With regard to research, of course, you could document the findings, but you could also document partnership formation, challenges, lessons learned. Those things could be in an article. You could also do something like a documentary. You could do an art exhibit. Back to the articles, or back to the findings of the study, you could do that in an article, but you could also put those results into a policy brief for a policy audience. You could make an exhibit. So you could really get creative. Think about both conventional and innovative products. So even with innovative products, it's really critical to subject those to critique and to disseminate them broadly. If you remember our definition of what makes scholarship, that stage of subjecting to critique and broadly disseminating, those were the cornerstones of scholarship. So, where can you publish, or where can you disseminate your conventional and your innovative products? You could go the conventional route. Special issues of disciplinary journals are a good option. You'd be surprised at some of the disciplinary journals that have published about community-engaged scholarship. Even something like Internal Medicine has published a special issue on community-engaged scholarship. There are also many, many journals that are available, and more coming out every year, that are really focused on engaged scholarship, community-based participatory research, social justice, those sorts of things, and they cross disciplines. So that's the conventional route, a journal. A little bit more innovative would be a journal that has some really unique kinds of publication possibilities. So for example, and this is just one example, Progress in Community Health Partnerships publishes the original research article. They also publish lessons learned articles, educational resources, practical tools, policy briefs, community perspectives. All you need to do is kind of talk to the editor if you're a little confused about what to do, and they're happy to help you figure out which of their article types might be appropriate for what you want to do. Then there are more innovative publication outlets for those innovative products that we've talked about. They are still peer-reviewed. So for example, MedEd Portal is about medical and dental education. It's not specific to community engagement, but they do accept products that are from community-engaged activities as long as they have to do with medical and dental education. And it is a real sort of Cadillac, high caliber, and well-accepted repository of these peer-reviewed educational products. Merlot.org, Merlot, which I like because it sounds like a wine, stands for Multimedia Educational Resource for Learning and Online Teaching. And like the title says, it is about educational products and teaching-related products. Again, not specific to community engagement, but they certainly would be happy to have products that are about service learning and other forms of participatory or community-engaged educational endeavors. CoursePortfolio.org, or also called Peer Review of Teaching Project, is another example. Public is a journal of Imagining America, which is an organization about the design, arts, and humanities engagement. And they really publish some very unique sorts of pieces. I was asked to review a conversation that was documented as a script, essentially. It was a really unique opportunity to review, and they really have some very interesting publications. And CES for Health, the one in the icon there, is Community Engaged Scholarship for Health, and it is a project of Community Campus Partnerships for Health. And it publishes the actual products like the videos, the documentaries, the policy briefs, etc. As long as they are community engaged and have something to do broadly with health, very broadly defined, that might be a possible outlet for you. Now, how do you get peer review of things, like curricula and policy briefs and documentaries, et cetera, if there aren't mechanisms for peer review that meet your needs? I'm going to give you an example from my own experience in University of Minnesota Extension Service. Extension Service folks develop things like curricula and educational tools, toolkits, websites, all the time. What they tend to do is they set up what I call the do-it-yourself or DIY peer review process, where they send that material to colleagues in Extension around the country, and they ask for an objective review, just like they would ask for a peer review at a journal. And they get back written comments, and then they respond to those. They make iterative improvements, and they increase the quality, and they might go back and forth with those kind of ad hoc reviewers until everybody feels sort of satisfied that this product is as good as it can be. The point is to seek critique, to make improvements, to seek more feedback, get it vetted essentially. You're making iterative improvements through that expert input. You might seek both academic and community members as appropriate peer reviewers in that process. You're trying to enhance the rigor and the quality of the presentation of the product. You can seek this sort of feedback process along the way, as well as the final product at the end and in the dissemination stage. It's important for promotion and tenure purposes to check on whether that do-it-yourself process is going to be something that if you documented it well and you hung on to those peer reviews and showed your work, your revisions, that would be something that would be acceptable as a peer review process in terms of listing those products as peer-reviewed or juried publications on your vita. Now let's turn our attention to the other strategy for overcoming promotion and tenure challenges that we'll cover today. It's important to know what makes community-engaged scholarship high quality. Those reviewing your promotion materials may be unfamiliar with community-engaged scholarship, and you might need to be clear about why your community-engaged scholarship is high quality by the standards that we use in this field of community engagement. The characteristics of community-engaged scholarship that I'm going to review are modifications of some criteria that were developed by Glassick, Huber, and Mayeroff in 1997. Glassick et al. Wrote a seminal sequel, I would say, to Ernest Boyer's classic book called Scholarship Reconsidered. Boyer said, you know, scholarship is not just research, and it's not just the peer-reviewed publication. We can also have the scholarship of teaching, scholarship of integration, scholarship of application, scholarship of engagement. And then, unfortunately, he passed away. Glassick, Huber, and Mayeroff came along and wrote the sequel called Scholarship Assessed, and they said, well, if we're going to think about Boyer's expanded definition of scholarship, we're going to need some criteria to evaluate the products of those sorts of expanded definitions of scholarship and the scholars that engage in those forms of scholarship. And then I worked with a small work group from around the country to take these, what we call Glassick criteria, and modify them for the specific situation of community-engaged scholarship. Okay, so the first one that I want to review is clear academic and community change goals. Now, right off the bat, we see that the modification here is that Glassick would have said clear goals. We're saying it's two-sided in community-engaged scholarship. It's clear academic and it's clear community change goals. So for this one, the scholar should clearly define the academic and the community goals of their scholarly work and clearly state the basic questions that they have for their inquiry. Clarity of purpose really provides a critical context for the reviewer to evaluate the scholarly work. They need to know what you're trying to do. Now, in italics on each of the slides that I'm going to go over, you'll see some examples of what it might look like if you possessed this characteristic, essentially, of quality community-engaged scholarship. So, some examples might be, you identify intellectual and significant questions in your discipline and in the community, things that are also relevant to the community. You are very articulate about articulating your program of research and your objectives, for instance, in your promotion and tenure scholarship essay in your dossier. Likewise, you clearly articulate your goals for teaching and for student learning in your teaching essay in your promotion and tenure dossier. The second one is about adequate preparation, both in your content area and in grounding in the community. So you need to be well prepared and knowledgeable in the developments both of your field and in the community that you're going to be partnering with. The ability to educate others and conduct meaningful work depends on mastering existing knowledge. That's kind of our discipline. But you need to add on top of that and be familiar with things like what's going on in this community. You need to invest time and effort in developing those community partnerships, maybe spending time volunteering or talking with leaders in the community, understanding what the issues are, how do the demographics of that community play into both the assets and the challenges that that community is facing. Of course, you need to be scholarly and demonstrate that you know the existing relevant literature and scholarship that came before you. You might need to demonstrate that you are participating in training or professional development related to disciplinary sorts of techniques or knowledge, but perhaps also things like participatory research or specific methods, maybe like community needs assessment. And then a really important piece of this also would be demonstrating that you're doing the personal work that's required to work in communities, particularly communities of disadvantage or communities of color, where cultural humility, cultural relevance, cultural sensitivity are really important. The third is appropriate methods. Now, in community engaged scholarship, what we're trying to demonstrate here is that we're not sacrificing rigor for community engagement. That's why it says rigor and community engagement. So what you need to do is to demonstrate that your community engagement actually maintains or even enhances the quality of the work that you're doing as a result of your partnered work or your engaged work. So a couple of examples here. An educational one might be you're revising the curriculum and the community placement requirement with a community partner in, let's say, a service learning course based on student feedback and community partner observations. A research example might be that through that community partner dialogue, you are able to refine your research question, or at least confirm its validity and its relevance through kind of co-generating with the community partner. The fourth characteristic is significant results. This is both significant results in terms of how it influences your field, your discipline, but also the impact that you're making in the community. You need to evaluate both, whether or not you're achieving your goals for your discipline, as well as whether you have achieved your goals for community impact. Recall that's kind of referencing back to the clear goals criteria back in number 1. So examples of significant results might be having an impact on change in health or social policy. It might have to do with something a little bit more focused on the academic institution in terms of enhancing the ability of your trainees or students to assume positions of leadership and community engagement scholarship. It might have to do with opening up additional areas for further exploration and collaboration through your work. That might be about your own work, but also opening up those opportunities for your students or for other collaborators, or for the community to sort of take it and run with it. The fifth is effective presentation or dissemination, and it's both to the academic audience and to the community audience. So you need to possess effective oral and written communication skills that enable you to communicate to your academic audiences. This is what we're typically trained in, but you also need to be able to communicate to other audiences in more layperson terms or non-disciplinary jargon. You need to figure out ways to disseminate to both audiences. Think again about those conventional products that might be more appropriate for the journal manuscript that our academic peers would look at, but also what might be some innovative products that would be intended for the community audiences that either don't have access to journal articles or are not interested in reading something like a full journal article. So some examples of how you might demonstrate that you possess this kind of a characteristic of effective presentation and dissemination. Of course, publishing your research or your teaching innovations in peer-reviewed journals would be obviously required, but you might go on and do something like produce a scholarly policy document for service providers or for legislators. Another marker of appropriate conduct in this dissemination phase is co-authoring with community partners, because this can really increase the effectiveness of communication with community audiences, and community co-authors tend to be fairly creative in thinking about what kind of communication strategy would be appropriate for their peers in their communities. The sixth one is reflective critique. And this has to do with really seeking out understanding, figuring out what the lessons learned were in order to improve the scholarship and improve the community engagement. So you need to demonstrate that you can critically reflect on your own work, on the community partnership, the issues and the challenges that arose, and how you rose to those challenges. What did you do to overcome them? So some ways that you might do that: you could conduct debriefing sessions with community members after a project is over. You could change project or course design based on the feedback that you get and the lessons that you learned from community partners. You could engage in personal reflection concerning, for example, issues of your own privilege or racism. That kind of goes back to that criteria we were talking about in terms of adequate preparation and doing the personal work of your own cultural background, your own privilege. And here it comes into play where you really need to be a reflective practitioner and bring to bear that understanding on what might have been the influence of your background on the success or some of the challenges you faced in your partnership. Seventh is leadership and personal contribution. So a scholar needs to demonstrate an ability to serve in leadership roles, need to build a relationship, a reputation for your contributions in the field. And this is one of the most consistent themes in promotion and tenure, that you have that reputation. Depending on your level that you're going up for, what rank you're going up for, it might be a local regional or a more national or a more international reputation. The challenge, as we talked about in the first video, is you often might be developing a reputation very locally because that's where your partnership is. But you need to be able to parlay that reputation for leadership in that community or in that partnership into a reputation more broadly. So you might be able to seek out invitations, and I say that seriously. Invitations sometimes you think you need to sit and wait for, but you can actually build relationships with others in other academic institutions or in community hospitals or community organizations, and that might then result in an invitation to come present to their grand rounds or a professional society meeting or some sort of a national conference or an international conference. Also, things like receiving awards, nominating yourself or asking others to nominate you for awards related to community engagement, for community impact, for advancement in the discipline. Those are all ways that you can demonstrate that you're making a personal contribution to your field and to the community, and you're demonstrating leadership. And again, I want to stress that you might need to be active in that process in terms of getting recognized for that. And you need to balance your sort of self-consciousness about that with your need to be recognized and to document your successes for promotion and tenure. And the last one is consistently ethical behavior. This is about socially responsible conduct of research and teaching. You need to foster respectful relationships with everyone that you're interacting with, students, peers, community participants, etc. And you need to, of course, conduct your own work with integrity and honesty. Part of this is also conducting your work in a way that considers cultural or community implications, as well as university policies, and to really hold those tensions and balance those priorities. So, some ways to demonstrate that. Obviously, you need to subject your work to ethics review, certainly through your academic institution, but when available, you might also subject your work to a review from a community IRB, or maybe less formal than a community IRB, at least some sort of a community committee that might review your work for that cultural relevance, cultural sensitivity, and what the possible impact, positive and negative, might be for the community. You need to approach communities as mutual partners to foster trusting and equitable partnerships. As I'm sure you know, it's not appropriate to come into a community and say, I know what you need and I can deliver on that. So portraying yourself as a partner and a co-learner rather than the expert is typically the way to kind of live up to this criteria. Focusing your work on community assets, not the deficiencies, while understanding what the challenges are and what the needs of the community are, that's extremely important, and that can be done most effectively through good partnership. And then including partners in the writing and as authors of scholarly work is another important piece of ethical conduct, making sure that they are getting credit for their contributions, having those discussions early on to make sure everybody understands what's going to lead to authorship and who wants to be part of that process. Now, looking ahead to our webinar, what we're going to spend some time on in the webinar will be getting to some very brass tacks strategies for preparing a dossier that can help you make your best case for promotion or tenure as a community engaged scholar, and then we'll have time to open it up for questions and dialogue. So I look forward to seeing you on the webinar. Thank you.